high numbers in the Bible are actually a form and a way of telling real historical information. They just might not be using numbers the way that we do today. This is Genesis 3:15. It says, and this is God's judgment because of the deception of the snake. He said, I will put enmity between you and the woman, and between your seed and her seed. He shall bruise your head, and you shall bruise his heel. This is where we are being made known that it's going to be important to pay attention to genealogical lists that you see coming up. And within the first 11 chapters, there are 2 genealogical lists, 2 chapters dedicated to it entirely. We're going to cover one of those tonight, but I wanted to rehash this because these chapters of genealogy can often be just brushed over because it's just a huge list of names, but they're of great importance and they do point to something. And I think it's either 1st or 2nd Chronicles. The first 8 chapters start out as just one big genealogy. So if you really want to read about genealogies, go to Chronicles. You can read about them for 8 chapters. The other thing that we covered last week was garden imagery, and what garden imagery was in the time that the Bible was written to all cultures, and obviously the biblical culture as well. And that was the idea that garden imagery was the language of heaven and earth in the time of the biblical authors. So God planting his garden, that, the garden that is within Eden, that is where heaven meets earth. And God assigned Adam and Eve as the royal priest in that garden. And ultimately we got a perfect high priest that came. Eventually, after much error on the side of humans, we got Jesus who came and fulfilled that role of the perfect high priest. Now, one thing I left out last week, and I couldn't believe it once I was going back over the material, this is just amazing. It involves the story of Jesus, and it involves the story of Jesus on the cross. In the Gospel of Luke, chapter 23, the scene is familiar. It's when the criminals are on the cross with Jesus, and one looks over Adam, and he said, Jesus, remember me when you come into your kingdom. And Jesus responds by saying this. He said, truly I say to you, today you will be with me in paradise. And that Greek word paradise is the word paradisio, and when it is translated, it is actually the word for garden in many instances. And within the Greek Old Testament, so the Old Testament written in Hebrew, but right before the time of the New Testament was written, they essentially made a Greek copy of the Old Testament known as the Septuagint. When the translators, who were all Jewish scribes, translated the Hebrew Old Testament into Greek, they used this word paradisio to describe the Garden of Eden. 15 of the 28 occurrences of this word occur in Genesis chapter 2 and Genesis chapter 3. And I know this slide is hard to see, but basically everything that you see in yellow right there is that word paradisio, and this represents Genesis chapters 2 and chapter 3. So when Jesus says, you will be with me today in paradise, it's you will be with me in the garden. You will be with me in Eden. You will be with me where heaven meets earth. So I think that's just amazing, and it's one of the ways that we can really dive into the mind of someone within that time period as well. That to me at least, it amplifies the meaning of it. Paradise is not just some far-fetched idea. It's this Eden imagery at play in the life of Jesus. And then we ended last week by asking this very lengthy question, but it was, are we allowing the Bible to be what it is intended to be, or are we imposing our current worldview on the Bible in an attempt to answer the questions that we as modern 21st century humans ask? And so again, this picture, it has shown up every week. It will likely show up again, but just this idea that we have ancient thought right here, modern thought right here, and when we merge the two together, it makes a pretty picture. In the case of Starry Night and the ultra deep field view right here, makes a very pretty picture when we combine them. But what you will notice in this picture where they're combined is that the pattern and the imagery of this original picture has been hidden in some places and even removed. And so trying to dive back in, what did this text mean to the original audience listen, I'm just as guilty as the rest. It's not me pointing the finger to anybody, but when we impose that modern worldview back on the text that we're reading, much of the time unintentionally, just because we grow up in the world now, not in the world back then, we look at it through the eyes that we're familiar with, and we can dive back in to the mindset of the ancient original recipient. We can see the patterns, and that's ultimately what we're trying to do and weave through. And that's incredibly important. I personally believe it's incredibly important, especially for these first 11 chapters of Genesis, given that the terminology, imagery, and themes end up repeating themselves throughout the Bible and are meant to form a pattern and also build a vocabulary of these images, these terms, these themes that we are supposed to carry on with us throughout the text. And chapter 5 is a great example of this. Again, I mentioned chapter 5 is all genealogy. It's literally just a list of names. And it can be very easy to brush over because let's face it, it's boring to just sit there and read, so-and-so fathered so-and-so, who fathered so-and-so, who fathered so-and-so, and hey, here were all their ages. It's what do I get out of that? But there is great meaning in doing it that we'll cover here tonight. But this does follow, this is the second occurrence of that generations pattern that we see in the book of Genesis. Again, there's 10 instances in the book of Genesis where where it starts with the phrase, these are the generations of. And this is the second one of them. The first one was back in Genesis 2, verse 4, where we looked at that potentially being a transition between the cosmic creation and then the creation within the Garden of Eden. And we also talked about how within these 10 times, they're never meant to look back, but always meant to look forward at what is going to come. So in this case, we see in Genesis chapter 5, verse 1, this is the book of the generations of Adam. And so that's where we'll pick up, but this does take us back to Genesis 1:27, where humans are created in God's image. We went over that, the first poem in the Bible that says, so God created man in his own image. In the image of God, he created him, male and female, he created them. And we talked about in week 1 how, because of the wording of that, or in Hebrew, that word man right there, it's likely a reference to humanity. So God created humanity in his own image, and we get that because of the male and female right here. And then, again, the him right here is masculine because this word is masculine. Humanity is a masculine word, and Hebrew, like every other language, pretty much except English, is a language of gender. And so because this is masculine, that has to be masculine too. So grammar spiel over. We'll get on to actually the first 5 verses of Genesis chapter 5, verse 1. And I have, what you see highlighted here is every instance of the word Adam. And the reason I have it highlighted here is because there's been much discussion about how the word Adam here should be interpreted. And every interpretation is open on the table. The green, it's set in stone. That is actually Adam, as in the person Adam. This is the book of the generations of Adam, the man Adam. What you see in blue here is where people have questioned, and you'll see every translation possibility. So when God created Adam, he made him in the likeness of God. And so when I say Adam there, I mean Adam is in the Hebrew word. So you'll see some translations will say when God created human or humanity. Some will say when God created Adam. All I'm getting at here is that these 2 instances in blue, there's much discussion around them, and it really has to do with what we talked about last week of when God creating humanity, were Adam and Eve the first people. All of those views come into play right here. There's really no question once you get down here, because it starts giving the age of Adam, the days of Adam, and thus all the days that Adam had lived. You can't, if that's all humanity right there, then how do you explain all of us here today? So it's a reference to a specific person. But there is much discussion around that. Again, you'll find Bibles with every kind of translation, every possibility is on the table. So it's one of those, it's very much open for discussion. It's an interesting issue to look into. Again, just making it known to you here tonight. Interesting to dig into. But when we look at Genesis chapter 5 as a whole, we do see a design pattern emerge. And that design pattern, we talked about how it's just naming off a bunch of people. It's very much kind of the old or ancient way of doing the edit, copy, edit, paste trick. And then just, if you're sending an email template to a bunch of people, you just delete one person's name and insert it throughout the email list. But how it occurs is it will say, A lived X years and then fathered B. A lived Y years after he had fathered B. A's whole life lasted X plus Y years. And so X would be the patriarch's age when the first child was born. Y would be the number of years from the birth of the first child to the patriarch's death. And then again, that X plus Y, it's the total combined age. So it does follow this pattern, and it follows it very strategically. Throughout the whole text, there's 10 people listed. Here's a list of 10 of them. And you'll see in blue here, there's narrative inserts at certain points for specific reasons. We're not going to cover every single name on here, by the way. We're just going to highlight some of the important ones. This list has given much discussion, or there's much discussion around this list, and there's some really just fascinating details that emerge in this list as well. But, and we'll cover a couple of these people. But you can see here, I got the old guy's rule right there, because the ages out here are astronomically high in terms of how we understand ages. I mean, you've got The lowest age on there is 365 years, and the highest age on there is 962 years. And so again, there's connection actually to several, to one place in the Bible, but then also to a text outside of the Bible from that time period, and we'll actually look to cover them both. I'll start out with kind of the comparison between Cain's line and between Seth's line. So if you remember, Cain was the brother who killed Abel, Adam and Eve's first son, Cain, and then Seth was the replacement for Abel that we looked at last week. And so what's building here is this is Cain's line from Genesis chapter 4 right here. And in Genesis chapter 5, we get Adam's line through Seth. I'm sorry, I said Abel and I meant Seth. Seth was the replacement for Abel. And it's showing us that Cain's line is that line of sin, and once we get to Genesis chapter 5, we see a righteous line coming forward that ultimately ends in who else? Noah, who is the main character of the flood story. So there's this buildup in genealogy. The genealogy list is a buildup of individuals to show God walking with righteous people and building that line through a righteous son, Seth, rather than through Cain. And it really goes back to that verse we looked at from Genesis chapter 3, where the seed of the woman will be against the seed of the serpent. And so if you want to think of Cain's line as the serpent seed line, and Seth's line as from his mother, from Eve, and how they'll always be at war with one another. You can think of it that way. But I'm going to hone in on two of these individuals right now. You'll see Lamech we covered last week. He was, from Cain's line. He was the individual that bragged on murdering people, and then said, if Cain receives 7 times vengeance, I will get 70 times 7. It's interesting here that you have a Lamech in this line too, in Seth's line, and that his total age is, go back a slide, 777 years. And so there's an idea that, and I meant to say this earlier, that there's various interpretations of this. One is that the years are to be taken literally, as they lived 930 years, for instance, with Adam. He lived actually 930 years. There's others that would suggest that these years are more, just as Jeremy was talking about with 40, that there's actually mathematical meaning and number play going on. And so that 777 could be a play on Lamech in that view. It could also be that the number 7 is the number of perfection, or a number of completeness, so you get 777, so as complete as it can possibly be, or in a sense perfect. And yes, and then also, again, you see Tubal Cain right here, who's from the line, which is a very interesting name. It means produce of Cain, but that'd be like someone naming like my great-grandson 10 down the line, like produce of Brad or something. It's just a funny name when you look at it. But he has 3 sons, and then that contrasts with Noah's 3 sons, Shem, Ham, and Japheth. Now, the other document, this is obviously from the Bible that we're looking at here, so there's a contrast between these 2 lines here. Again, it goes back to the seed of the serpent and the seed of the woman. There's also a document from that same time period known as the Sumerian king list. And it is a list of kings that descend, and there's comparisons that we'll look at between that and Genesis chapter 5, maybe for some polemic literature play going on. Again, polemic is kind of religious polemic in this sense, is an aggressive verbal attack on someone else's beliefs, and in this case, the biblical authors may have been taking shots at other cultures around them, saying, hey, it's actually Yahweh who's the one true God. But the Sumerian text is essentially, it's a composition that it was compiled somewhere between the 2nd millennium BCE, and it's just essentially a list of kings from that kind of ancient Mesopotamian area. But there's 10 kings from the creation of kingship to the flood. The flood was that we'll talk about. There was a kind of universal, back in that day, understanding that a flood had occurred. And so you'll see flood stories from all across the ancient cultures. Talked to Pastor Todd before this, how that can actually be a source of affirming that there was an actual event. If everybody's talking about an event that happened, just gave details a little bit different, hey, something probably happened, let's just figure out which one was actually right. We obviously would believe that the biblical one is correct for many reasons, but yes, there are 10 kings from the creation of kingship to the flood. The first king, who I'm not going to try and pronounce his name, is appointed by the oldest gods. And then the final king is chosen to survive the flood. In contrast to this, there are 10 generations from Adam to the flood of Noah. Noah lives after the flood. Adam and Eve are appointed as the royal image, that royal priesthood within the garden by the God of Israel, by Yahweh, the one true God. And then Noah, the 10th, is chosen to survive the flood. So you see some striking similarities here. And I'm going to say this right now before we get a little bit more into this. This does not mean that, because you'll hear this argument occasionally, and it's a really bad one. And whether it comes from secular scholarship or more Christian-based scholarship, scholars will agree that it's a bad way to argue this point. But they'll say, see, look, the people in Genesis, they just took this Sumerian king list and then they just copied it over word for word and just inserted their own names. Nobody in the academic world thinks that. So it's a very bad argument. But anyways, we go on and on about that, but we won't. You'll see a striking similarity that there's very high, even more astronomically high age ranges within the Sumerian king list. You've got 67,200, so a little bit more than 930, but you'll see the numbers are higher. And there's been discussion around, is there correlation essentially between the ages from the Sumerian king list and the biblical list? Before I get into that, though, I do want to point out something that's, another similarity to this. You'll see this guy right here. Again, I'm not going to try and pronounce these names. By the way, if you have this list memorized for the Sumerian king list after this, Jeremy has an Amazon gift card for you, so see him. He can quiz you. But this is the 7th person in the Sumerian king list line. And it contrasts with Enoch, who's the 7th person in the Genesis 5. Now, this character right here had a unique relationship with the gods of his time, according to this story. And Enoch, it was said, Enoch had a unique relationship with Yahweh. It said he walked with God. And so there's similarity there, and it goes more in depth than that. But what's very interesting is that this king right here on this list was actually, again, he's 7th in line. And it ended up that the city that was associated with him, the main deity that they worshiped there was the sun. So it was a city of sun worship, essentially. And some people have drawn the fact that Enoch might actually be a play of the 365 years that Enoch lived before he was taken up. Again, Enoch walked with God. He did not see death. Is actually a play against this king right here and the sun deity, basically because we have one solar year would be 365 days. So again, it's an option on the table. I'm not here to say it's right or wrong, but people have drawn correlation to, more polemic here going on, so that the statement would be that 365 wouldn't be the literal amount of years that he lived. Rather, it's a play and an understanding on he's being contrasted with someone whose main city had sun god worship as their main form of worship. So interesting there as well. And then this is something just going on with the high numbers thing from the Sumerian king list. People have long recognized that they use a base 60 system. So we use a base 10, kind of 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, 8, 9, 10. In the ancient world, they used a base 60 system. So every single one of these ages in some way, shape, or form is within that 60. It goes back. You can do all kinds of mathematical formulas based on the number 60 or 60 times 60. And then this focus on the number 60 represents a common ancient Near Eastern convention rather than biological reality for the Sumerian king list. And the intention is to idealize kingship by expressing the duration of each reign in terms of multiples of the fundamental number. So 60 being the fundamental number, they're just saying, hey, our kings are correlated with this fundamental number. And then in the Genesis genealogy, there's a play on this number 60 system. Obviously, the ages aren't as high, but it uses multiples of 60 or even 60 itself. And there's a really good article that I read by, I can't remember the guy's name. It was something Bailey. But he did all the mathematical formulas in there. And basically, when it comes down to both of these lists, is there's an understanding that there's some kind of ancient mathematical play going on here as well. And like Jeremy said, there's nobody from that time period living around to be like, hey, here's the answer to the code. It's like the Da Vinci Code. Like, you just can't crack it. You know what I mean? Like, we don't know it yet. We don't have enough information, but it's fun to dive down the rabbit hole on this. But here's an interesting correlation right here, because we'll talk about the flood here momentarily. But the volume of Noah's Ark is 450,000 cubic units, which can be expressed in this long equation based back to, guess what, the number 60. And so there might be a play actually on that as well. And then this is something that's related because you get Abraham, you get Joseph, people that were in Egypt, you get Joshua as well, and then also Sarah, Abraham's wife. The ideal age, and this is more just to show you how numbers are thought to be or discussion around like number play within the Bible, but the ideal age among the Egyptians varied between 110 or 120 based on various Egyptian sources. When you look at the people who had some time in Egypt, you see that Moses lived to be 120, Joshua lived to be 110, Joseph lived to be 110, and then Sarah is kind of the oddball out in a good way. She lived to be 127, but the thought behind that is that she lives the perfect age of 120, or that ideal age of 120, and then she gets a bonus 7 being a number of completeness. So Sarah gets a bonus, whereas Moses, Joshua, and Joseph did not. So way to go, Sarah. But it's just up for discussion as well. And that's just to show you how kind of number play, again, Jeremy talked about the number 40, but how there's thought behind various number play throughout the Bible. And I'm not going to read this whole spiel right here, but essentially what it's saying is there's a scholar by the name of Dave Fotts, I believe is how his name is pronounced, but he did a dissertation, and I think he's a believer as well. I think he is. But he did his entire dissertation for his PhD on high numbers in the Bible. And he goes on to say this, and his work was, I heard it in relation to the conquest and the Exodus about high numbers in military, that kind of thing. But he said this: the large numbers are often simply figures of speech employed to magnify King Yahweh, King David, or others in a theologically based historiographical narrative. And so high numbers, this kind of summarizes this quote up here, high numbers in the Bible are actually a form and a way of telling real historical information. They just might not be using numbers the way that we do today, where it might be the number 40 represents that completeness. It might be the number 7 represents, again, a complete cycle, or we go down the rabbit hole with all the examples throughout the Bible. But it's just a way, again, not saying it's right or wrong one way or the other, but it's a way to think when we come to high numbers, maybe within that Genesis chapter 5, maybe it's a way to think about it. Maybe it's a way to just approach the conversation. Because one point of discussion that people have brought up in relation to Genesis chapter 5 is this: when God promises Abraham and Sarah that they're going to have a child, Genesis 17:17 says this: then Abraham fell on his face and laughed, and he said to himself, shall a child be born to a man who is 100 years old? Shall Sarah, who is 90 years old, bear a child? And when you look at the age range on that Genesis chapter 5 list, the ages range from 65 to 500, and the average age is 156 when the father had a child. So in other words, the average age where a child was born to someone from that Genesis 5 genealogy is 156. And people have asked the question of, well, if the average age there was 156 and someone even had a child when they were 500, then why would it be a big deal right here for Abraham and Sarah to have a child when he's 100 and she's 90? And there's various thoughts around that, but it's just something to bring to mind that there might be something else going on besides literal interpretation of the ages.